The time of year that we're in right now is just past Easter. And I hope you had a wonderful time together sharing both in the sorrow and the seriousness of Good Friday and the weight of what our sin has done in the world and how Jesus took that upon himself and died. But then also the glory of the resurrection that comes after on Easter Sunday. And in the church calendar right now, we're kind of in between the resurrection and the ascension. In fact, in the church calendar tradition, we celebrate the ascension on Thursday, the 26th. So just a few days from now, where Jesus physically removed himself from the earth and was seated at the right hand of the Father, as we saw in the worship and revelation that was read earlier, and sent the Holy Spirit to be with us. And so it was challenging for the first disciples of Jesus to be in that position. They understood when the resurrection came, when they saw Jesus raised from the dead, they understood all of the Old Testament and the scriptures and the teaching of Jesus in a new light, more fully, and so they could understand what Jesus was actually doing. He wasn't saving them just from the Romans. He was saving them from sin and death itself, which the Roman government in their time represented in a way in their system. And so that's why it's with us still today, but they still had not experienced the ascension of Jesus Christ and the coming of the Holy Spirit. And so one of the questions as Jesus was telling them that he was going to leave them was, well, where will that leave us without you? And the question that comes to me as I think about that is, well, if we look at the time Jesus spent on earth, as described to us in the Gospels, can we discover the kind of place he most liked to be? And maybe if we could become that kind of place, we would fully, he's with us always, but maybe we would fully experience his presence with us if we could become the kind of place that we know from the Gospel stories he loved. And that's an interesting question that's worth considering. He did say in Matthew 28, I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. But sometimes, though we know that intellectually, we don't know that in our experience. And we'd like to experience that more of the time while we're alive. So I think I know how to get to that place that Jesus loves to be. And I'm going to give you directions. The ancient city of Jerusalem was a walled city. In the first century, when Jesus walked the streets, it was all contained within the old walls. And it had 7 gates. And one of the gates was the Fish Gate. And the Fish Gate opened up to a large road that went northwest to Caesarea. And Caesarea was the seat of Roman power in that entire region. So it's an important road. If there was an uprising on the streets of Jerusalem, the troops would come down that road and come in the Fish Gate to calm things down. That was kind of an official road that much government and Roman traffic traveled. There was another gate called the Ganath Gate, and it led out of the other side of Jerusalem down another large road that went through Bethlehem to Jericho and then on to the Jordan River. And that's the road that any business or anything coming from the entire Arabian and Babylonian world would come in that road and that gate. So an important gate there. There's another gate called the Sheep Gate, which was on the north side of the city, and the road there led up through Samaria to Antioch and places beyond there that were also important for trade and politics and everything else. Now the Jews tended not to use that gate because they didn't like to walk through Samaria, but in terms of the city and the business and the trade, that was an important gate. So I'm not going to go through all the gates, just those ones and one more. There was a little gate off the east side of Jerusalem, kind of off the corner of the temple, Herod's temple, and it didn't have a name. It was called the Southeast Gate. It didn't warrant like a Fish Gate or a Ganath Gate or a Sheep Gate. It was just the Southeast Gate. And one of the reasons for that is because very few people ever used that gate because there was no road up to that gate. There was just a path. The reason for that is easy to see if you look at the geography. The southeast gate opened into the Kidron Valley, and the trail leading up to the gate was very rough and rugged and rocky. You might climb that trail and go in that gate with a backpack on, or maybe with a donkey, but you certainly would never take a camel or a cart with luggage or trade goods or anything like that in the southeast gate. Once you came out the gate and scrambled down into the Kidron Valley, you were faced with either going north or south along the valley to one of those other roads I talked about, or climbing up the Mount of Olives, which was another steep and rocky climb. And when you got to the top, even if you were fit like Jesus and his disciples obviously were from walking back and forth and across all of Palestine for 3 years, you would stop for a rest at the top. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we have many conversations happening between Jesus and his disciples on the Mount of Olives, because they're going somewhere, and when they climb up, they're going to rest there. But then when you get up the Mount of Olives and look further east to the Jordan River, the land gently sloped down all the way to the river from that point. And the archaeologists and people that look at the old world and think about these things and study them tell us that the entire slopes in that direction at that time when Jesus was alive were covered with fig trees. This is where the figs were grown that were eaten in Jerusalem and surrounding areas. So figs at that time was not an important crop. I mean, I shouldn't say it wasn't important. Figs was a staple in everyone's diet. It wasn't a money crop. The grapes and wines and the sheep and goats for the meat and everything, that's where all the money was in farming. Figs were important, but you weren't going to get rich farming figs. But that's what grew on the slopes, the downward slopes from the Mount of Olives. So if you travel on down the slope from the Mount of Olives, through under the groves of trees, you come to a little village. And it's not on the main road, it's off the road. And in that little village, you can come to a house, quite a large house, but not an opulent house. One that doesn't catch attention and isn't noticed by passersby. And in that house, you find the place where I think, as Frank Viola in his book, in the title of his book, named it, he called it God's favorite place on earth. God's favorite place on earth. A house in a town. It's the kind of place, maybe you know the name I'm speaking of already, maybe you don't. It's the kind of place that you could so easily just travel by and not notice it's actually there. It's the kind of place that's near the road, but it's not on the road. It's the kind of place that only people who actually live there ever go to. Nobody goes there unless they live there. Or maybe if you have a friend or family member who lives there, you might go there. And maybe you guys know a little town, something like that fits that kind of description. But it's not unimportant to Jesus. It's the place, I believe, in all the world he most liked to be. Let me tell you a little bit about this place. Some of you have guessed already. The name is Bethany. That name doesn't feature really prominently in the gospel stories. In fact, if I asked you before telling you this, if you got a chance to go to the Holy Land, make me a list of the places you want to go. You'd probably say Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea. Would Bethany have even made it on the list? Probably not. Maybe for some, but probably not. But let's just think about Bethany for a minute. It's not mentioned by name very often in our Gospels, but if we piece the stories together and think about the geography and where it happens, there are a lot of things that happen at Bethany. Do you remember the story where John the Baptist is baptizing people in the Jordan River? And obviously when this part of the story happens, it wasn't at the Jordan River. But remember when John the Baptist said, I'm not the one you're waiting for, but there's one coming after me whose sandals I'm not worthy to tie. He said that in Bethany. Now, if you remember the story where Jesus saw a fig tree, kind of a clue there, right? He saw a fig tree and he went to get the fruit, but there was no fruit on it. And then he cursed the tree, and then the next morning when they got up, the tree was withered and had died. That was at Bethany. Do you remember the story when Jesus cleared the temple and got out the whip and turned over the money changers' table? Okay, the beginning of that story, he's in Bethany. He goes into Jerusalem, does that, does the teaching, everyone gets mad at him, and it's dangerous. He leaves town and he goes to Bethany, spends the night. And the people who are trying to find him to kill him don't find him. Do you remember the story of course you remember the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. Well, that was in Bethany. And you probably remember the story, because it's just Easter behind us, of the triumphal entry, Palm Sunday. Well, when Jesus said to the disciple, go and find the man with the jar and the colt that I'll ride on, he said that in Bethany. He was in Bethany when he said that. In fact, as you piece the different gospel stories together, you find that whenever Jesus was in the region around Jerusalem, as far as we can tell, he spent every night at Bethany. The last week of his life, for sure, because Bethany is a Sabbath's walk, exactly a Sabbath's walk from Jerusalem. So on any day of the week, if you were in Jerusalem, you could walk till Bethany. And so the last week, the Passion Week, we know for sure that Jesus spent every night in Bethany. He didn't sleep in Jerusalem. He went to Bethany. And so extrapolating from that, and it's kind of partially a guess, but it seems whenever we have the information in the stories, when Jesus was in the south, in the region of Jerusalem, he stayed in Bethany. And then there's one more story. You remember when Jesus was lifted up in the clouds and the angel said he will return the same way? In my imagination, when I read that story, it's always a beautiful mountain and a beautiful trail and green trees and grass and a trickling brook, and Jesus is miraculously raised up. But if you actually look at the details, that happened at Bethany. That happened on the road just out of Bethany, because he stayed the night in Bethany with his disciples before that day when that happened. It becomes very clear that Jesus loved Bethany. He went there frequently, and he was comfortable there. To put that all together, because it's not explicitly stated, and in many of the stories, the name Bethany isn't even mentioned. But you need to do a bit of biblical detective work. You need to go through the Gospels and kind of pay attention to the timelines and to the amount of distance traveled and the people that were present and stuff like that. And you can put that together quite easily and see that this is true. And I don't take credit for that. I believe I probably have the skills. I could have done it, but as I mentioned, Frank Viola does this in his book, God's Favorite Place on Earth. And so you can just read the book, and he puts that all together, all the different places in the Gospels where Bethany is mentioned and how it plays out. But I'm just going to give you a taste of that so you get an understanding of what I'm talking about. And then we're going to think a little bit about the application and implications. So if we start in Matthew chapter 8, you can look these up if you want, but I'm just going to read them quite quickly as I go through. In Matthew chapter 8, verse 1, it says, "A large crowd followed Jesus as he came down the mountainside. Suddenly a man with leprosy approached him and knelt before him. 'Lord,' the man said, 'if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean.' Jesus reached out and touched him. 'I am willing,' he said, 'be healed.' And instantly the leprosy disappeared. Then Jesus said to him, 'Don't tell anyone about this.'" Now the name of the man is not mentioned, but I think he's one of the only ones that Jesus told not to tell who actually didn't tell. So that means something. So this part is just a guess, but it's just a fun guess, so I put it in there. But the next story comes from Mark chapter 14, and we read there in verse 1 to 9, "It was now 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The leading priests and the teachers of the religious law were still looking for an opportunity to capture Jesus secretly and kill him. But not before the Passover celebration, they agreed, or the people may riot. Meanwhile, Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon a man who had previously been healed from leprosy. Now, I'm just thinking maybe this is the same guy. That's not, that many of these other connections are clear. This one's a bit of a guess, but that would have made an impression on Simon to be healed by Jesus and then have Jesus come to his house. So the house of Simon. Now there's several Simons in the Gospels, so he's identified. He's not Simon Peter. He's the one. Remember the one that was healed from leprosy? That's the one. That's who he is. So that's the house they were in. And then this is the part of the story I'm just going to read a little bit about, and it'll come to your memory. While he was eating, a woman came in with a beautiful alabaster jar of expensive perfume made from the essence of nard. She broke open the jar and poured the perfume over his head. Some of those at the table were indignant. Why waste such expensive perfume? They asked. And you can continue to read that story on your own time as Jesus answers their questions. But this is the story. We remember this story as the one where the expensive perfume was broken and anointed on Jesus. But according to John chapter 12, who relates the same story, it happens in the house of Martha. So in Mark's rendition, it happens in the house of Simon, who was healed of leprosy. And in John's story, in John 12, it happens in the house of Martha. Now, this is pointed out to us quite enthusiastically by atheists as a contradiction. How can the same thing happen in two different houses? But I think it's actually quite easy to understand if you read the Old Testament. Now, one more story, and I'm going to read this one from Luke 10, verse 38. And I'm reading from the Message paraphrase just simply because there's a phrase that Eugene Peterson puts in there that I really love, the way he puts it. So in Luke chapter 10, verse 38, as they continued their travel, Jesus entered a village. Now, the village isn't named in this story, but we can figure out which village it is. A woman by the name of Martha welcomed him and made him feel quite at home. She had a sister, Mary, who sat before the master, hanging on every word he said. But Martha was pulled away by all she had to do in the kitchen. Later she stepped in, interrupting them. Master, don't you care that my sister has abandoned the kitchen to me? Tell her to lend me a hand. The master said, Martha, dear Martha, you're fussing too much and getting yourselves worked up over nothing. Only one thing only is essential, and Mary has chosen it. It is the main course and won't be taken from her. Now I'm going to stop there, but you can start to understand how you read these many stories that mention Martha and Mary and Lazarus and Jesus and Simon, and you can put together all the different things that happened in Bethany at this house. And as far as my research, which wasn't too extensive, was able to discover, the house is no longer there. But if you go back to early photographs from when cameras were first invented, they took pictures of the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus in Bethany. And it's clear from the pictures that it was, like I said, a fairly large house. And you can tell that from the stories, because Jesus and 12 disciples and various hangers-on, like a woman with a jar of perfume, would come in the house and recline at meals. So that it was a bigger than average house, and probably walled around so that when they went in there, and when the people were looking for Jesus because he'd cleared the temple, the guards were looking for him. They didn't find him because he was in a house behind a wall and comfortable there. So Frank Viola continues through all the different passages and pieces it all together, and this is the story that emerges, and it's I think a beautiful story. And it starts out with a man who has a large house and probably runs a business out of this house, probably related to the fig industry. Either a farmer of figs or packaging them or some aspect of that. Of course, we have no idea, but given where it was located, it probably was connected to the fig industry. So not where you get rich, but where you can run a sustainable business. He comes down with leprosy. Now, we don't know if he was the elder uncle or the father, or possibly even some people think the husband of Martha. But I think father's the most likely, with a mother that's never mentioned, died from something earlier on. He has 3 children, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, and he gets leprosy. Now, if he stays in the house, the business will die, because anything he touches is contaminated for 7 days. And anyone that touches him is contaminated for 7 days, unclean, and has to go through a purification process. So if he stays in the house, where I'm sure he would prefer to stay, the business will die. No one will do business with them if you're going to be unclean for 7 days after you do any business. So this is not in the scriptures, but just looking at the Old Testament law and the practices, it seems quite likely that Simon is the man. Simon would have made arrangements for his children to take over the business, and then he would leave home. Martha was the eldest. Lazarus was still too young to take over this responsibility. So quite likely, he gave Martha the business, the signing authority. I don't know what words they used in those days, but whatever it was. So then Simon's house becomes Martha's house. But it's both of their house. It's correct either way you say it. And so then Simon goes off to live with the lepers, the kind of person that has to yell out in the street ahead himself, beware, lepers are coming, you don't want to touch us, you'll become unclean, and kind of an outcast in that way. Now, I don't know if it's the story I just read where Jesus healed a man with leprosy, if that was Simon or a similar experience, or if he may have recovered on his own. We don't know. But I like to think it was that experience that's written there in the gospel stories. And so, in any case, his leprosy is overcome. It says that he's healed. He was healed of his leprosy. And so he comes back home and lives with his children again, but he's probably more elderly now, and the children are grown up. And so instead of taking back the reins of the business, it's better to just leave it like it is, with Martha as the head of the household at this time. And that fits with Old Testament law, and it fits with customs in the first century, that's what would have happened. And so that's the story you have. It becomes clear then that Jesus loved these people in this place as he stayed there so often. A place where he and his friends, his disciples, as we would say, could let down their hair. Maybe out in public when you're speaking on the mountainside, you don't let out a big burp. But in Martha's house, you can do that. But it's not only that, and it's kind of a joke, but I'm serious about that, because we know that the disciples would get confused by his parables and some of the things Jesus did, and in the evening, in Simon's house, they would ask their questions, and he would give the detailed explanations. So this is where they felt comfortable talking about the stuff that they couldn't talk about out in public with other people around. And as Eugene Peterson puts it, Martha welcomed him and made Jesus feel quite at home. And isn't that how I want to feel with Jesus? Isn't this how you most want to feel with Jesus? Just at home. I mean, yeah, other people can have these amazing miracles, manna from heaven on the mountainside that feeds 5,000, or, but day to day in my life, I just want to feel at home with Jesus, comfortable, like I can burp in his presence. In church, maybe we don't do that, but, where as you guys have done here, where the kids can make noise and we're okay with it. Jesus can be here with us and the noise and the stuff. There's not a lot of places on this earth where Jesus feels quite at home. That was true when he walked physically on the earth. And we know that because Jesus himself said that foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. There was no place where he could comfortably just lie down and get a night's sleep. But every rule has an exception, right? And there was one exception, except in the house of Simon, who had been healed of leprosy. There he could lay his head down. There he had a place to lay his head. And that's still true today, isn't it? Where can you go out in society around us and find a place where you can bring up Jesus and it's perfectly comfortable? Because two things happen. The most common thing is we don't want any talk of Jesus unless you're going to use it as a curse word or unless you're going to use it to criticize somebody. Or if people are comfortable with the name of Jesus, it's very much unless you have a suit and tie and you do the right ritual and you sprinkle the right water, then it's okay to bring up Jesus. You can't really sleep in that place. But Jesus needs a place to lay his head where he feels at home. And he found that place in Bethany. And he found that place in the house of Simon, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. They were his best friends. Even more so, I think, than his disciples that followed him around. He was always arguing with them. But the only story we have of Jesus breaking completely apart is when Lazarus died. It's the only story where he wept like that. Lazarus was his friend, his close friend. And he loved going to his house to just be there, to just hang out. Ministry's stressful. But at Lazarus' house, he could relax. He could let his hair down. He could just be himself. It's a beautiful story when you piece it together. So let's go over those directions again. How do you get to God's favorite place on earth, where he just likes to hang out? Well, let's mention one more thing before I get there. I just thought of it. The first question before how to get there is, who are the people? What kind of people produce the place where Jesus feels that comfortable? Simon, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, as far as we know, never left home. They never followed Jesus around as his disciples did. They never went on a missionary trip. There's no evidence that they were there in the upper room when the Holy Spirit arrived. They never experienced walking on water. They never experienced feeding of 5,000 on the mountainside. They weren't there for any of those things. Many of the stories started in their house, but then Jesus and his disciples went out and did those things. Where were Mary and Martha and Lazarus? Simon. Well, they were at home, taking care of business. And so they stayed home. They went to work every day. They took care of their responsibilities. And when Jesus came by and knocked on the door, they opened it and made him feel at home. And that's the picture we get in Revelation. Remember, I didn't look up the chapter and verse. Maybe some of you remember it. It says Jesus is knocking at the door. It's not the door of unbelievers in that story or in that word of Jesus to the church. It's the door of the church. And what does it say if we open the door? He will come in and do an amazing miracle? He will come in and part the waters? Or no, it says, I will come in and eat with you. I will come in and just make myself at home. That's what Jesus wants to do. That's the kind of people Jesus, to this day, wants to hang out with. Day in, day out. As we take care of our responsibility, as we go to work, as we change the dirty diapers, as we clean up the floor, as we nurse our injuries, as we do the stuff we do every day and just keep doing it every day, the same as every day before. That's where Jesus was most comfortable. So how do you get there? How do you get there? Well, if you start in Edmonton instead of Jerusalem, don't take Highway 16 and then on to Route 21 where all the traffic is going north to the oil field and the making of money. You won't get to Bethany that way. Don't take Highway 14 east out to Saskatoon and Regina and the center of Canada as people from there. We have a few here today from Ottawa. Don't go that way. You won't get there. Now, the busiest road out of Edmonton is 2 south, isn't it? It's crazy down there, but everyone's going to Calgary and again, making money, doing business. Don't take number 16 west. Everyone wants to go there. Jasper, the mountains, and who doesn't want to go there? It's beautiful. You might think the mountains and all that beauty is where Jesus most likes to hang out, but that's not the picture we get here. No, I think if you want to get to the place where Jesus wants to just hang out with his people, you take number 28 north out of Edmonton. Now, most people in Edmonton will say, what, 28? Is there even a 28 that leaves Edmonton? Well, yeah, there is. You probably don't know or take that highway unless you live down there. And they say, some people will say, oh, yeah, 28, that goes to Gibbons, right? Yeah, it does. But on the way to Gibbons, if you just don't blink at the wrong place, you might notice just off the highway, not among the fig trees, but among the flowing grain fields and wheat and canola, there is a little place if you turn off. And if you turn off there and go just north of the arena, you will arrive at Bethany. Bonaccord. And you'll find a little group of people who don't have amazing stories that would light up the news channels of all the things that God has done miraculously. But they just like to hang out with Jesus. They open the door, and Jesus feels right at home. And that's the most beautiful thing on all the earth. Jesus never promised he'd do miracles forever. He did promise, I will be with you always. And if you open the door when I knock, I will come in and I will eat with you. I'll make myself at home. It's the most important thing you can do in all the world. The history books won't write about you. The news channels will never write a story. But it's the most important thing you can do in all the world. Just open the door and make Jesus feel quite at home.